So thanks for having me on to speak today. As Suzanne said, I'm Stefanie Simpson, and I'm the Blue Carbon Program Manager for Restore America's Estuaries. So today I wanted to talk about the intersection of blue carbon and living shorelines. I'm going to start out with some slides on really what blue carbon is and why we're interested in it, and then talk about that connection with living shorelines as well. So I've got about a 15 to 20 minute presentation planned, and then would welcome any questions that you all might have as well. So I'll go ahead and get started. And first I just want to note, we're all very familiar with the list of ecosystem services provided by healthy coasts and estuaries. So today I'm really going to talk about one of these ecosystem services in particular, highlighted here as climate mitigation, but we also call blue carbon. And blue carbon is the ability of coastal wetlands to mitigate climate change, and is kind of the newest ecosystem service that we have been working to quantify in coastal ecosystems. And so our goal at RAY has been to explore ways to utilize blue carbon to achieve more of our coastal restoration and protection goals. So I wanted to go ahead and lay out what our definition of blue carbon, and you may have heard blue carbon or coastal blue carbon. These terms, at least in the coastal sphere of things, have been used kind of interchangeably. There are other ocean ecosystems that also talk about blue carbon, but today I'll be talking about blue carbon in respect to coastal blue carbon. And what we mean by that are those greenhouse gases that are stored in, sequestered by, and released from coastal marine ecosystems, including seagrasses, mangroves, salt marshes, and other tidal emergent wetlands. And our goal, again, in recognizing this ecosystem service is to provide an additional opportunity to add value to our efforts, to enhance management of, and then also increase public and private investment in coastal habitat restoration and conservation. So at RAY, we're exploring using blue carbon through several different approaches, and I will just kind of briefly go over some of our approaches here. First, we are working to pilot access for tidal wetland activities into the carbon market, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a few slides. We're also supporting science by leading and supporting assessments to determine exactly how much carbon is stored with these systems and how much can be stored through coastal or restored through coastal restoration. We're working with our federal and state partners to explore policy and regulatory options that can help drive increased protection and restoration of tidal wetlands. We're coordinating activities regionally and nationally through various working groups, and we're working to raise awareness and build capacity through webinars like this, and also workshops and resource development. So again, I want to go through just very briefly some kind of background knowledge. When it comes to blue carbon, we can get into the weeds rather quickly. So I'm going to try to keep this high level, but I also want to offer some good background information on what we're talking about when we talk about measuring and accounting for blue carbon in these systems. So here I have kind of the big three greenhouse gases that are relevant in coastal ecosystems. The first one being one that I think probably more readily comes to mind, carbon dioxide, which we know is sequestered or captured by plants through their normal photosynthesis, and then is stored within the plant material and the soil. The next, nitrous oxide. This is really mainly related to anthropogenic causes where agriculture is used on or near wetlands, so it's not always necessary to be accounted for depending on the landscape in which you're working. And finally, methane. And methane is of particular interest because, like nitrous oxide, it's more potent greenhouse gas. So if we were to reduce methane emissions, that could lead to a larger climate benefit on a smaller scale. And now methane can be quite challenging in wetlands, and that can be very variable, and depending on what kind of wetland system you're working in. So in the past few years, we've had more research into these different greenhouse gases and what they mean in coastal ecosystems, or how their fluxes, what attributes to their different fluxes, and how we might be able to manage for these. An interesting study has come out, Poffenbarger et al., who demonstrated that there is actually a relationship between salinity and methane. And this has been further confirmed by additional studies, including Holm et al. Last year. And basically, their research shows that at salinities below 18 parts per thousand, methane is going to be highly variable. But when you get to kind of that sweet spot at salinities 18 to 20 parts per thousand and higher, methane is negligible. And so I want to call this out because this is important when we're looking at specifically impounded wetlands. So wetlands that were naturally influenced by the tide, but then have now been cut off due to usually like a dike or some other kind of infrastructure that's been put up and then reduced or eliminated that natural tidal flow, resulting in what was historically a saline system becoming fresh, and then the fresh system then emitting methane. So in our restoration efforts, if we're able to reintroduce that tidal flow into an impounded wetland and increase that salinity, we would also be decreasing methane emissions as an added benefit to that work. So I know that was technical and a lot of science. I'm going to get into just a few more kind of background information on what on the significance of blue carbon, and I'm realizing I think my slides are a little out of order, so bear with me for a second while I just move these back in order. I'm not sure how that happened. Okay, here we go. So we know that coastal habitats tend to be great photosynthesizers, meaning they capture carbon at really highly efficient rates, especially when compared to their terrestrial counterparts. And this graph is a great depiction of it. It uses a logarithmic scale, and it shows that wetland habitats can accumulate that soil carbon up to 10 times more per hectare than forest. And forest conservation efforts have gained a lot of traction for their ability to sequester carbon, and so we want to be able to see our coastal wetlands valued similarly. So in addition to all these other great ecosystem services that they provide, they're also very important carbon sinks. And I mentioned in the previous slide that soil accumulation rate because the soil is where the real magic happens. So where the previous slide showed carbon accumulation rates, this one shows carbon stocks. So when we look at a comparison of carbon stocks, you see that coastal habitats, primary carbon storage is in that soil rather than the biomass, whereas in our terrestrial systems, the majority of that carbon storage is in the biomass. And this is an important distinction because when the carbon is stored in the soil, as long as it remains there, it can remain locked up for centuries or more. So although these coastal systems only take up about 2% the area that terrestrial forests do, they are storing significant amounts of carbon on a smaller per area basis. And I'll also note one more thing about this particular graph, and that's that this graph only shows carbon stored in the first meter of soil, but in many cases these habitats sit on much larger. The soil depth can go much deeper, and so these are fairly conservative estimates of how much carbon is actually stored within these systems. So now we'll get to that other slide that popped up early. So another thing I want to point out that not only are these systems really effective and efficient at capturing carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, but they're also trapping sediment and trapping decaying plants within their system. And so as these systems are consistently inundated, that means that the soil is very anoxic and decomposition is low. And so that allows this carbon to really build up over time. So in many cases, again, the soil depth in the wetland systems can be several meters deep, meaning that there can be decades or even centuries of carbon stored under these systems, further highlighting the need to protect these habitats, not just for those other ecosystem services that we know are important, but also to protect these large carbon stores these habitats sit on. And now, nationally, but also globally, we know that these systems are facing unsustainable rates of loss. When they are drained and degraded, that stored soil carbon can oxidize back into the atmosphere, leading to a relatively rapid release of what could be hundreds of years of stored carbon back into the atmosphere in a matter of decades or less. And it's estimated that roughly 500 million tons of carbon dioxide are released due to wetland degradation every year. And to put that amount in perspective, it's roughly equivalent to the emissions of an entire developed country like the United Kingdom or Japan. So again, this further highlights the need to not only invest in restoring these wetlands, but also in protecting those remaining intact wetlands, and look for new and innovative ways to bring more resources to conservation and restoration efforts. So that kind of summarizes the what blue carbon is. So now I'm going to turn to why we're interested in blue carbon. And so I've highlighted these three main reasons why we at RAY are really interested in blue carbon. The first is that we want to be able to achieve real and measurable. Whoops, I think I lost there it is. Real and measurable greenhouse gas emission reductions that can also support the overall purpose or other ecosystem services provided by these systems. We also want to provide additional value to the work that we do in conservation and restoration of these systems. And we want to tap into additional funding sources. And this third one I'm going to take a couple moments to give additional background information on, because the funding that I'm talking about is through approaches like inclusion into the carbon market. And so I know that this may be a fairly new topic area for many of you. So I'm going to take a moment to kind of go into how the carbon market works and where that opportunity is for coastal wetlands and recognizing blue carbon. So carbon offsets are generated from projects that prevent emissions and or remove atmospheric greenhouse gases. So there are many different types of project categories for doing this. A couple examples may be a wind farm that's preventing carbon pollution, or it could be a methane reduction project or an afforestation project, and then removing carbon, which would result in removing carbon from the atmosphere. So in this particular example, a company, but it could be a government or an individual who wishes to reduce their carbon emissions may choose to do so through many means. First, we would encourage them to make internal changes that could reduce their overall emissions. But for those emissions which cannot be avoided, they may choose to purchase carbon offsets. So here, Company A needs to meet its emission reduction goals. So they invest in an emission reduction project like reforestation or hopefully coastal restoration. And in turn, they receive the carbon offsets generated from that project. So this is a way for them to simultaneously reduce their emissions while also investing in sustainable projects, which is really a win-win for everyone. Now, carbon offsets are generally measured in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. You'll see that equation at the bottom of the screen. So this is just to ensure consistency in accounting. So if you could imagine a project that would generate methane reductions, methane being a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, that could generate a lot of CO2 equivalents and therefore a lot of offsets. So there's kind of the big three tidal wetland activities that we refer to that could result in greenhouse gas reductions and therefore carbon offsets. The first would be restoring wetlands through enhancing or just restoring plant communities, and then this is going to include a variety of different activities that would result in this. Basically, because you're restoring or enhancing the plant community, you are increasing that sequestration and therefore that greenhouse gas benefit. The second we refer to as a stop loss. So in this instance, we would be halting ongoing emissions that would be due to drained or degraded wetland, but also, as I mentioned before, from reducing methane emissions by reintroducing tidal flow to an impounded wetland. And then the third is preventing the stock loss. So in that, I'm meaning protecting those intact wetlands, conserving what's already there, and therefore protecting their carbon stocks from being released. So that's kind of the basics of carbon markets. And so what we've been doing is working with partners to develop methodologies, which are protocols outlining the accounting procedures for determining how much carbon would be reduced through wetland activities. So this is kind of just a general overview of that process. You have your methodology or protocol development. You would do a feasibility study for a particular set of activities, because I do want to mention that not all coastal wetland restoration activities would result in enough of a carbon benefit to then pay for all the kind of costs that's involved with setting up a carbon offset project. So you'd want to have to do this feasibility study to make sure that a carbon offset project would be right for a specific set of activities. I'm not going to go into too much detail from this. I will say that there are a few methodologies available specific for tidal wetlands, calling out specifically this one that's highlighted here, the VM0033, which just is kind of its identifier. It's the tidal wetland and seagrass restoration methodology that was developed by Restore America's Estuaries and our partners. And general kind of overview, and the reason why I'm mentioning it is because it is widely applicable to tidal wetland and seagrass habitats globally, and it also includes a wide array of eligible activities in which living shorelines would be included among that. If you'd like more information on the methodology or other market tools, we've got several available on our website at estuaries.org/bluecarbon-resources. So these are kind of the three main ones I would call out if you are interested in learning more about carbon offset development. Of course, the restoration methodology that I mentioned, but that is a very technical document. So we developed this project guidebook, which is the middle one here, and that really kind of will hopefully serve, our hope is that this serves to orient you to how the market works and how you might use the methodology in your project planning. And then the final document listed here is the field manual. That was developed by CI and IUCN, and that's for going out and getting that blue carbon data. I would also mention that we have several webinars on carbon markets and specifically this methodology. If you're interested to learn more, you can check those out also on our website. So that was a very fast-paced 101 of blue carbon and carbon markets. So hopefully I didn't inundate you with too much information with that. But I do want to kind of then try to talk about this connection between blue carbon and living shorelines. So Suzanne shared with you this study last week, and as far as I know, it's one of very few studies that have been conducted to specifically quantify the blue carbon benefit in Living Shorelines project. It was conducted by Carolyn Curran and her team at the NOAA NOS Beaufort Lab in North Carolina. And so using data from their study, they estimate that all of the current living shoreline projects in North Carolina would remove 64 metric tons of CO2 per year, which should be like offsetting 7,500 gallons of gasoline. And this is a really, really interesting, great study to show how blue carbon can add value to projects like living shorelines. And I hope to see more studies like this one in the future. If you're interested and you haven't had a chance, I would urge you to take a look at this paper, and Suzanne and I could connect you with that if you need. Some other ways to think about blue carbon in living shorelines efforts are to include blue carbon in grant proposals and monitoring plans. In this way, you're accounting for more of that full suite of ecosystem services provided by this work. And I also kind of see it as a way to differentiate, perhaps your proposal from another proposal, that you're including this added element of blue carbon benefits. The second point here I want to talk about is in the carbon market world, we have this notion of permanence. Which basically means we want our projects to have some longevity to them, especially since you're in this market where you're selling greenhouse gas offset benefits of a project for a price. Purchasers want to know that the benefit will be around for a while. So generally, projects are required to demonstrate that offsets generated have some level of permanence built into the project design, and this is where I really see living shorelines can kind of add value in blue carbon project development, because we know that the advantages that living shorelines provide include stabilizing the shoreline and increasing resiliency to things like sea level rise and erosion. So I think that's a really great kind of connection where blue carbon and living shorelines can kind of intersect in developing carbon offset projects. And then finally, in our work, it's helpful to have different ways to speak with stakeholders about the importance of healthy coastal ecosystems and investing in restoration. And so we often find that one message does not always work, and that having multiple ways to talk about ecosystem services can reach new and broader audiences. So I would urge you to include blue carbon ecosystem services in your kind of communication toolbox when you're speaking to various audiences. And this is the last slide I wanted to kind of squeeze in for this abbreviated talk on blue carbon today. In addition to kind of the market opportunity and added value, there's a larger context of all of this work. And there are many different partners involved across the country and the globe working to further our understanding of ecosystem services and how we can use blue carbon to add value to our work. So this is a list of a couple of those networks to help increase awareness of these if you'd like to become involved or interested to learn more. Back in 2015, Restore America's Estuaries organized a U.S. national working group with NOAA to advance pilot projects and database development. It was quite a successful meeting, and we plan to have another meeting of this group in 2018. Secondly, there's the Blue Carbon Initiative, which brings together governments, research institutions, NGOs, and communities from around the world. This initiative is coordinated by Conservation International, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, and it involves both a science and a policy working group. Thirdly, the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation, or CEC, coordinates activities in America, including working with NOAA, EPA, and sister agencies in Mexico and Canada. And they have created a blue carbon working group working to increase the mapping and data of blue carbon habitats for the North American continent. And recently, an effort has been forming to create a global blue carbon network and database, and this is being led by Conservation International, USGS, and the Smithsonian Environmental Research Committee. This is something that actually was an idea that was brought up at the first meeting of the National Working Group and now has some legs behind it, so that's really exciting. And then finally, I'll just end with a little bit of a self-plug. If you are interested in learning more about blue carbon, I send out a once-a-month Blue Carbon Buzz e-newsletter. And you can sign up for that on our website, which I've listed on the screen now. And so included in that monthly newsletter, I include new publications on blue carbon, different webinars, workshops, and other events if you're interested to learn more. So with that, again, apologies for a very kind of fast-paced intro to blue carbon, but I welcome any questions at this time.
Thank you, Steph. That was fantastic, and it is a whirlwind tour, and I would definitely encourage folks to get a hold of Steph if you do have questions. So at this point in time, we will enter the Q&A portion. So to ask a question, you can either send an email, supposedly, or a chat question to me, or I would encourage you to electronically raise your hand, and I am happy to unmute your line so you can ask the question directly. At the moment, we don't have any questions from the group, but I do have some. And so, one of the things that and Steph, you go ahead and leave that your contact slide up there as the final one, and we'll just leave it on your screen if that works for you.
That's good.
So that way folks can write it down and they have a chance to get a hold of you. So you talked about the market. So what is the size in terms of dollar value, if you know, of the voluntary market right now, so people can get a sense of how much money is out there?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. It's not an easy one to answer. There is a status and trends report that's produced every year by Forest Trends that has more details in it about the status of the market as it changes each year. But this is a multi-million-dollar market. I have to get my notes in front of me, but about $78 million worth of carbon offsets are sold over the globe. Now those represent different project areas, including forestry. I talked about some methane or livestock kind of projects, wind-powered projects. But I will say in their analysis they found that the projects that tend to be most attractive to investors are those that can also provide co-benefits, of which we know coastal ecosystems provide many. So our hope is that once we get some pilot projects underway and can demonstrate how carbon restoration projects can generate offsets, that this would be a very attractive purchase for carbon offset investors.
Great. Okay, another quick one, not a quick question, but you brought up the idea of permanence in the talk. Can you address that a little bit more and the role that living shorelines helps play, particularly if you look at the timeline that's required for these projects and the adaptation with sea level rise?
Sure. So I didn't get into kind of the requirements of carbon offset project development, but there are these kind of global standards that set the requirements for projects to make sure that they are properly accounting for greenhouse gas reductions and ensuring that offsets that are bought represent real reductions in greenhouse gases. And there's a couple of big standards that do this: Verified Carbon Standard, American Carbon Registry. Some of you may have heard of some of those, but generally speaking, they all set their own kind of requirement for the longevity and which offsets must demonstrate. It's usually between 50 and 100 years. Now that could be kind of a scary time frame for coastal restoration work, because we know we have a lot of risks, including storms and sea level rise within the work that we do. But that's a great area where I see the advantage, the benefit of adding in a living shorelines component of a project if there wasn't already one. We encourage within the project design phase to think about the resiliency of a project beyond just a couple of decades, but even a century or more if we can. Now, standards realize that you can't 100% guarantee that your offsets will, that a storm won't come along and kind of undig some of the carbon that's been stored. But there are methods that you can also take that they allow for to kind of address those risks of reversals, including providing buffer pools. But definitely, adding living shorelines aspect or component to a project, that would be a great idea for increasing the resiliency of a system, because we know that that's the advantage that living shorelines provide, is added resiliency to sea level rise and erosion.
Great. We have a question, and I'm going to read it verbatim. The objective of permanent benefits is complex, and you mentioned not all coastal restoration activities can result in a net carbon offset. Can you speak a bit more about ephemeral habitats like seagrass? So how does seagrass fit into this overall dialogue when you think about, I always think about things like marsh and mangroves, which tend to be much more long-lived in broad terms. So how does seagrass fit into this?
Well, seagrass are definitely, they're just as effective, if not more so in some situations, at capturing carbon and storing it in the ground. They're small but mighty in their effectiveness at capturing carbon. So they're definitely eligible for carbon offsets within the market. Because I'm sure that our audience is very familiar or aware that in working with seagrass becomes an added cost a lot of times to being able to go out and doing the monitoring that would be required with these projects. So that's where I would caution if it would be an appropriate carbon offset project. Really, you'd want to have a right scale to bring down the cost of monitoring so that it doesn't exceed what potential carbon value you could get from the market. It's very much a kind of a delicate kind of measurement of the benefit and the cost of adding a carbon element. But I also want to kind of highlight that carbon market, though I've talked about that today, it's not the only, reason why we're looking at blue carbon. Blue carbon is, again, it's a way to add that additional value to the work that we do. And seagrasses, along with marsh and mangrove, this is part of the benefit that they are providing for us, is being able to capture that carbon and storing it in the ground. And when we looked at Tampa Bay, we looked at I had a carbon assessment that concluded last year, where we modeled what was going to happen to the coastal ecosystem over the next 100 years due to sea level rise, and what that how carbon might be able to add value to some of the work that we do as far as restoring and conserving those habitats in the Tampa Bay area. And what I thought was really interesting, and you all may be aware that in Tampa they've had a lot of success in the past couple of decades at restoring their seagrass meadows. In fact, they have not just met, but exceeded their goals for restoring seagrass in Tampa Bay. And so when we looked at the forecast for what was going to happen for these habitats, we found that in some cases, mangrove and salt marsh habitats may be drowned out as sea level rises. But where water quality can be maintained, those seagrass could have an opportunity to migrate into those areas, thereby conserving those carbon stores and continuing to provide that and the other ecosystem services that are provided by these habitats. So I thought that was really, really interesting to show that this is added value for maintaining water quality and for providing room for these habitats to migrate as sea levels rise.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you. We have another question that's come in. Again, I'm going to read this verbatim. You mentioned that there are only a few research projects focused on blue carbon and living shorelines. Do you know of any researchers or organizations that are spearheading this movement? And is there a database where researchers can share gathered data regarding blue carbon?
Those are great questions. This NOAA NOS study from Carolyn Curran and her team is really the only one that I know offhand that has specifically looked at blue carbon benefits of living shorelines. I would certainly, if you'd like, you can reach out to me, or if you know Carolyn or Jenny Davis or others on that team, I would say reach out to them. They may have a better idea of some of the other work that's been done with regard to blue carbon and living shorelines. But I'd certainly, that's an area that I'd love to see more research come from. And then as far as an accessible database, this is something that a lot of some of the different working groups or networks that I mentioned on the previous slide are working to achieve. It's a gap that we realized we really need to fill because there's just so much data, especially in the last couple, 5 to 6 years. There's been a lot more blue carbon studies coming out, and so making that data more accessible is a goal of the different working groups that I mentioned, and that's something that we are working on. The one that I mentioned specifically, the Global Blue Carbon Network and Database, that's being spearheaded by Conservation International, USGS, and CERC. That is in the early stages of development. I believe, as I understand it, it would be housed at CERC or and accessible via their website. But I think we're a little bit ways off from that being realized. I would say a great way to kind of stay up to that is the Blue Carbon Buzz, if you'd like to sign up for that. As soon as that is realized and accessible, that's something that we'll be promoting wildly, because I think that would provide a lot of value to people.
Great. I love the idea of promoting wildly. That's okay, another question. So in the past, we have talked about shellfish, right? So shellfish are a component of many living shorelines projects. Is there any blue carbon benefits? I mean, we all know that there are substantial water quality benefits, and there's lots of habitat benefits, but is there any blue carbon that we can add on to that calculation when you include shellfish?
That is an excellent question as well, and one that I get a lot. And in short, we just don't have a lot of the science that supports that. Basically in the calcification process, it's not really a net carbon gain. For every mole of calcium carbonate that's captured, about 0.6 moles of CO2 are actually released. So the net balance there is not in favor of a carbon sink. However, we do know oysters trap sediments. Oysters and other shellfish can help to trap sediments, and which then helps to store that carbon that might otherwise continue downstream, be lost out to the open ocean. So I think there is potential for oyster reefs and other shellfish reefs to act as sinks for carbon, but more likely from the sediment trapping rather than from shell formation. Now, all that being said, like I started with, we really don't have a ton of science on this. So there seems to be a lot of variability in shellfish carbon, but as the science improves, if we can demonstrate that oysters do add a carbon value to restoration work, I think that would be a great added component. But for now, there's just not a strong clearly identified sink potential like there is for coastal wetland habitats, emergent wetland habitats. So we don't really usually include them when we talk about blue carbon.
Okay, great. Another question. Let's see. So in order for the carbon markets to work, there needs to be a limit placed on carbon. Is that correct? Right. In other words.
Sorry, yeah, if you could clarify.
Sorry, yes. So right now this is largely exists in the voluntary carbon market, correct?
Right, correct.
Right.
Well, at least it's in the U.S. Mm-hmm.
Correct. Yes, sorry, yes, in the U.S. So in order for the market to become even more, let's say, viable and vibrant, would there need then to be a cap placed or a limit set on how much, you know, plant A, B, or C could emit?
A regulated cap would certainly help to drive a market. So that would definitely help in raising the price of carbon and therefore the revenue, the potential revenue that could be generated from these projects. I would mention also that the voluntary market has been going for the past few decades and is fairly strong. A lot of companies that choose to purchase carbon offsets on the voluntary market do so for reasons of corporate social responsibility. They've set their own internal climate mitigation goals, but also they're in some ways anticipating that eventually there will be a national cap and trade market, and that they basically are purchasing offsets in the voluntary market in a way to prepare for that. Also, as we look for projects, different project categories, and as coastal wetlands is a fairly new project category to be added to the voluntary carbon market list of eligible offsets. In many ways, some state-run or regional-run cap-and-trade systems like California and RGGI, they often look to the voluntary market for success in those project categories before adopting them themselves. So, for example, in the California market, they do allow for carbon offsets. However, coastal wetlands is not yet a project category that is eligible in the California market, but we are hoping that, again, through demonstration of coastal wetland offset projects in the voluntary market, that would then be able to be included in those type of regulated markets where the price of carbon is higher.
Fantastic. All right. Well, that's certainly helpful, and I think you're kind of getting around this. But I think, and we don't. Let's see. I'm going to be diplomatic and say probably for the next 4 years, we're probably not going to have a cap or a limit placed anytime soon.
I would be shocked if that would be any different.
Right. Okay. So, alrighty. So let's see. Do we have anybody else have any questions or comments? Let's see. I did get a comment, said fantastic, succinct presentation on blue carbon and living shorelines. Very nicely done, Steph. Okay, any other questions, comments? Okay, Steph, any other, because I also want to keep this to under an hour, so we're at about 45 minutes past the hour. Steph, is there anything else that you would like to pass on?
I just thank you and to the Living Shoreline in Practice community for letting me speak today, and I'm available with the contact information on the screen. If you have any questions, feel free to just reach out.
Okay, great. So thank you again to everybody for joining us. I hope this was valuable. And as I said, we are recording this webinar and we will be posting it, and I will let you know when that happens. So on that note, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and please mark your calendars for the next Living Shorelines Community of Practice, which will be the third Wednesday in August, and we will be discussing basically a federal and Hill update in terms of what we can expect from the fall season as it relates to budgets, and there's some really interesting things happening as it relates to living shorelines with new authorizing language for some potential laws. So on that note, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the webinar now, and I look forward to hearing from you at another time. Thanks, and have a good one.